Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Arayes. That's right, apparently this translates to bride and groom, which seems very appropriate since I can't think of a better marriage than a crispy pan-fried pita that's stuffed with spicy, aromatic, savory meat. And by the way, these things must be pretty easy since this was my first attempt ever, and I think I pretty much nailed it. And to get started, we're going to need some kind of ground meat, which for me is lamb, but if you prefer to use beef or ground turkey, this technique will work the same. And what we'll do is spice this up with some smoked paprika, some ground cumin, some ground coriander. We'll also do a little bit of allspice, which of course tastes like all the spices. We will also sneak in a little bit of cayenne, as well as some freshly ground black pepper. And of course, we're going to need some salt. And then we'll finish this up with some freshly chopped Italian parsley, as well as some crushed or finely minced garlic. Or you could, if you want, grate it, which a lot of recipes call for. Speaking of which, the last ingredient at this point will be some grated onion, which is a very classic ingredient in these kind of Middle Eastern meat mixtures. And yes, by grating, you're going to get a very intense flavor. So for a little milder alternative, you could dice and saute the onion first. But personally, I do like the flavor of the grated, and I think it's well worth a few tears. And that's it. Once everything's in there, we'll give this a thorough mix, which I like to start with a fork. And then if necessary, I'll finish with my hands. Right, the theory being the less time my hot, sweaty fingers are touching the meat, the better. And since I was filming and didn't want to wash my hands, I just finished with the fork. But the point is we have to make sure everything's thoroughly and evenly mixed. And then we could, if we want, use it right away. But I think it's much better if we wrap it up and pop it in the fridge for at least an hour. And you could, if you want, go as long as overnight. And then besides our meat mixture, the other thing we can make ahead of time is our tahini yogurt sauce, which starts with a spoon of tahini, which is simply a sesame seed paste. And since it's usually kind of grainy and chunky and doesn't stir in well to other things, I like to heat it up a little bit before we mix it into the yogurt. But before we do that, we will add some freshly squeezed lemon juice and a little splash of cold fresh water. And then we'll zap that in the microwave for about a half a minute or until it's nice and hot. And even though that doesn't look much different, it's going to mix into the yogurt much better. So we'll go ahead and transfer that into some plain Greek-style yogurt. And then besides the two main components, I also like to add a little touch of crushed garlic, plus a pinch of cayenne just to stay in shape. And then we'll finish up with a little bit of salt before we take a whisk and give this a thorough mixing. And if you're thinking, shouldn't you have used a smaller bowl to make this easy task even more difficult? Well, first of all, I'll do the jokes. But yes, it is a good point. At home, please use something a little bigger. Okay, when I film, I always try to use the smallest containers possible, since that usually means you can see things better. But yes, a larger bowl would have been nice. But in any event, we'll want to whisk that until it's nice and smooth, at which point we'll wrap it up and pop it in the fridge until we need it. And then once our meat and sauce are set, we can move into final production, which means taking some pita bread and cutting it in half, at which point you'll hopefully be able to pull that open without the bread sticking or tearing too much. And if your pita is fresh, that shouldn't be too hard. And if it's not cooperating, you can heat it in a pan a little bit, which will soften it and make things a little easier. So I went ahead and did that to 2 pitas because I'm going to make 4 portions. And then we'll grab our meat mixture and we'll use exactly 1/4 of it in each half pita. And since I had never done this before, my intuition was to put it near the bottom. And then once that was accomplished, I figured I could just use my fingers and sort of squeeze it up towards the opening. And while my intuition is usually pretty good for these kind of things, this time it really wasn't. And that meat mixture was not moving around as easily as I had hoped. But anyway, eventually after a little bit of squeezing and pressing, I got it done. Oh, and if you do get a few cracks in the pita when you're stuffing, don't stress. Everything gets pretty much sealed up when it cooks. But anyway, I continued on, using what I learned on the first one. And for the next one, I placed the meat more in the middle, which did end up being easier to work with. And I should mention some people cut the bread into quarters, but I kind of like the appearance of the half pitas better. So to me, it was worth that little bit of extra effort. And that's it. Once our pita halves are stuffed, we can head to the stove, where we will heat up a generous amount of olive oil over medium heat. And once hot, we will carefully place our Arayes in, At which point we're going to cook these for about 3 or 4 minutes per side, or until our meat on the inside is cooked through and our pita gets beautifully golden brown and crispy. And we are definitely going to need to pay attention to the heat and make sure our flame is not too high, since the last thing we want to have happen is the outside gets beautifully browned and crispy, but that happens too fast and the inside's still not cooked. So I'm going to say do this on medium, but it's going to be up to you to adjust as you see fit. Right, that is just you cooking. But having said that, our meat layer is relatively thin, so about 3 minutes or so per side should be fine. And once that's done, if you're making more than one, you can transfer those onto a sheet pan and just keep them in a warm oven until the rest are done. So that's what I did while I cooked up the other two. And as you can see, we really do want to try to get these nice and browned and crispy. But just in case you don't trust appearances, let's give it the old fork don't lie test. Oh yeah, now that sounds crispy. Mostly because it is crispy, hopefully on both sides. And while these were pretty good at room temp, I do think we want to serve them right away while they're still hot, which I'm going to do next to some lemon wedges. And of course our tahini yogurt sauce, which I garnished up with a little bit of Aleppo pepper and a pinch of parsley, since I have to take some contractually obligated pictures. And after doing some of those, I picked one up and applied a little bit of sauce and went in for the official bite. And that, my friends, as I touched on in the intro, is a very, very successful marriage. Right, crispy pita bread surrounding delicious aromatic spicy meat, which is fairly rich, which is why I think a nice squeeze of fresh lemon is also very nice with this. And I know it doesn't look like there's a ton of filling, but believe me, it's the perfect amount. Okay, I saw a few versions online that seemed to have a lot more meat involved, which they must have baked, because there's no way that would have cooked through in a pan. But anyway, the most authentic versions I saw seemed to have just about this much stuffing. And for me, I thought it was the ideal ratio. Oh, and pro tip, if you put 2 dollops of the sauce on, you get to take 2 bites. But anyway, if you want to use more filling, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the Judy Bloom of this bride and groom. And speaking of vows, promise me that after you get this technique down, you will try it with different fillings, spiced according to your own personal taste. Right, this might seem like a specific recipe, but it is really just a technique. And there are just so many different directions you could go with this. Right, I'm thinking like Italian sausage and peppers, or maybe a cheeseburger Arayes with some caramelized onions inside that we would dip in a secret sauce. But anyway, no matter how you decide to tweak this, I think it's my new favorite sandwich that's not a sandwich. And I really do hope you give it a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.